maybe before we get too far, I couldn't help when we had our guest from Ron speak, think about some of the similarities that we see in our own province. It's not uncommon in the Western world, really, to see racialized communities who disproportionately bear the negative impacts of community development by time. And maybe the I-94, I heard someone in the crowd shout out, it sounds like Africville. I started thinking from northern Nova Scotia, it's not a coincidence that there was 2 dumps in Lincolnville. It's not a coincidence that we see the continued environmental racism, the Pictou First Nation with the boat harbor, which is yet to be fully cleaned up. And people here will know very well the challenges the residents of Perry's continue to live with. The reality is the impact can't just be measured in dollars. You look at the $157 million lost. That's before you count the fact that people grow up outside of the community where they were raised. It's before you factor in the fact that people may only see their grandparents once a year instead of every day. You can't put a dollar figure on that. And one of the things that I was reflecting on when I heard you describe it as $157 million lost, it wasn't lost. It went somewhere else.
Yes.
It benefited from that.
That's right. Exactly.
People who own the businesses in the industrial lands, it could have been zoned for a highway, probably benefited from more effective and efficient transportation routes. That $157 million went to somebody else's pockets. And it's time that we start adopting a mindset that actually reflects the value that is lost from one group that accrues a benefit to another. We're actually going to achieve equity when we advance policies that are meant to benefit everyone who lives in a country, a city, or a community. When I think right now about some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to housing, we are in a crisis in Canada, and it's starting to reach communities that aren't used to it. There are some communities, as I just mentioned a moment ago, that have been living in a crisis much longer. They know what overcrowding is like, they know what poverty is like, who haven't had access to adequate or affordable housing for generations. But we're starting to see its impact in a much broader swath of people across this country. And we're starting to see it impact people in very real and human ways that we may not have expected even a few years ago, let alone a generation ago. You're seeing young people who are priced in the market, who are choosing to live in a community other than the one that they were raised in. You see people who may not be able to find a place to rent, let alone ever have a dream that they can own a home one day. And shamefully, we see in some of the wealthiest nations in the world, we have our American friends here, we have Canadians in the room, we continue to see far too many people going to bed at night without a roof over their head at all. Now, we treat some of these outcomes as unfortunate circumstances, but my view is that they're a direct and predictable result of consequence of decisions taken over the course of generations. It's not a coincidence to me that we have a shortage of affordable housing when we have 30-year history in this country. We have governments washing their hands of the responsibility to invest in affordable housing projects. It's not a coincidence to me that we set the record for home building in this country back in the 1970s when there was massive investments in affordable housing and cooperative housing. And we saw governments decide, you know what, that may not be our responsibility. And I should say, both liberal and conservative governments have made this mistake on the federal stage. And it's time that we have to correct that if we're going to hope to achieve a different outcome. Because hope in and of itself is important. It's not strategy. You need to actually mirror that hope with feedback from communities who will tell you what they need. And then investments that actually lead to the outcome that we all want to see. Now, we've been busy over the last couple of years, last year in particular, for my own part, having come into this position around then, trying to listen to people to understand what they need. And it's shocking to me how often you hear consistent solutions come up. When you're talking to people who actually build homes, they tell you, look, inflation has really hurt us. We need to make sure that we have advantages that allow us to make the math work. Cost of material, labor, land supplies, interest, taxes, everything has gone up. Now, if we want to make differences, we actually have to figure out what we can do to help. We can put tax measures in place, we can put low-cost financing in place, but I think if we're going to do that, we have to insist that we get some level of affordability for the people who are going to live in the houses that get built. There's things we can do when we talk to communities to say, you know what, we can't necessarily assume that our communities are going to look a generation from now like they did a generation ago. We have to make it easier to build the kind of homes that allow for multi-generational living, to allow more people to live on the same property than did before. And if we may eat up some of the backyard of the small apartment building, we deserve a park next door. Because we're not trying to build storage units for people to sleep in. We're trying to build communities for people to live in all day. We can't do this if we don't actually listen to the feedback that comes in from the people who have lived experience though. It's one thing to talk to home builders. It's one thing to talk to municipal leaders. But it's another thing to talk to people who actually know what it's like to be homeless. You look across this country right now, there are far too many people who don't have a roof over their head. And it's going to take serious investments if we're going to make sure that every person is able to live with a safe and affordable place to call home. And before I talk about some of the things that we're working on to try to help solve some of these problems, just think about the cost of not solving the problem. My own view is accepting homelessness is a very, very expensive decision. You talk to somebody who doesn't have a place to go to bed, I guarantee you they are more likely to end up in an emergency room. I guarantee you that they eat up more of the healthcare resources if they can find a doctor to go to. They more often run into challenges with the police in our streets and in the court system that are utterly avoidable. And they don't have the same opportunities to maximize their own social and economic well-being by finding a job that allows them to support themselves and their families. Now think about the relative cost of building out enough affordable housing. So people who run into these challenges, which the cost of which accrue to all of us, right? Think about the relative cost of making sure those people have a home. Think about the people who don't have to go to the emergency room. Think about the people who don't have to spend their time dealing with the police or in the court system. Think about the people who have meaningful work that allows them to get ahead in life, perhaps take on a new and better opportunity for themselves. A generation from now will leave their kids even better off than they are. Now we can make those decisions to invest today. We have to accept that some of them make some time to play out, but my goodness, they are worth making because we can't afford not to. As part of the plan that we put forward, just in April of this year to address the housing crisis, there's a number of specific policies that are trying to tackle these problems head on. Look at the Affordable Housing Fund. This is a program that has benefited communities, including Akuma just locally, to help build out more affordable housing for the African Nova Scotian community here. What I love about the project that they've taken on nearby is it's not just a place for people to live when they're in their own home. It's connected to employment opportunities that are nearby. It's connected to potential childcare opportunities that are nearby. It's connected to potential future opportunities for long-term care so families can remain connected. I talked to a young woman who's raising her kids in one of the homes that have been constructed on site. And she told me that her alternative before she came there was between overcrowding her grandparents' basement or living in a shelter with her kids, neither of which was acceptable, neither of which allowed her to get ahead in life. But through the work of the community, the solutions identified by the community for the community, there's a person who's able to raise her kids in a safe place that she can afford. She's actually considering what other economic opportunities she's going to be able to pursue for herself. These are the kinds of stories that you hear when you work with people who know their community, advocate for the support they need to build out their community, not just the housing, but the entirety of the community. And I guarantee you a generation from now, you're going to hear stories about those kids doing much better than they otherwise would have. But it's important that we recognize that the programs do have to be designed. One of the things that's essential to understand is not all programs work the same way. There are certain communities that need help building the capacity, not just to build the building, but to even fill out the application in some instances. We see fewer applications come into our programs from Black communities. We see fewer applications come into our communities from small communities. We see fewer applications come into our programs from rural and remote communities, from poor communities. That's not okay. A lot of the communities who most need the support are least able to seek it because the capacity has been denied to them, not because people are less talented in one community than another, but because of historical discrimination that has left them worse off. We have created a specific stream through the Affordable Housing Fund. It's reserved for Black-led organizations that serve Black communities. It's one of the only programs in our entire suite of housing policies that is undersubscribed because we need to do more to build that capacity. So I expect follow-up calls on what we might be able to do to help. But it's not just building out affordable housing that we need to do. We need to make sure that we're putting in place the infrastructure for people to succeed. That doesn't just mean water pipes and roads, it means that too. It also means community centers. It also means job training opportunities. It means access to healthcare services. So we need to continue to come together like this to understand what the needs of the community are, so we can ensure that all levels of government can work together to build out these kinds of complete communities. Now, there are other programs that we're putting in place that I think are going to have a meaningful impact as well. We've got additional supports that help people actually prevent the loss of affordable housing that exists today in the marketplace. There's actually a lot of apartment buildings. There's a lot of homes in this province right now that are offered at fairly low rents. But guess what happens when somebody moves out? They get renovated, price goes up, and nobody can afford to live in them. Over the course of the past probably 15, 20 years, Canada has lost over 1 million homes that were offered at low prices in the market that have either been subject to renovations or had to be closed down because they were kept in a poor state of repair. With new funding on the table, we're working with nonprofit organizations so they can actually buy those up and keep them affordable forever. One of the things that I love about the land trust model, that it aligns so perfectly with the cooperative housing model. We haven't seen hardly a new cooperative housing project advance in this country in meaningful numbers in decades. We've got significant new funding on the table, $1.5 billion to help restore the role of the federal government in building into cooperative housing. But what I love about the projects that were advanced since the 1960s, 1970s that are still around today, guess what you'll find out? The number one thing when you go visit them, it's a lot cheaper for the people who live there to live in equivalent quality accommodations than it is for somebody who's living in any other apartment. It's because the people who run the building live in the building. It's the people who run the community live in the community. And guess what they're motivated by? The well-being of their families and their neighbors, rather than the profit of the corporation that's seeking to build out those developments. Now, this is not an argument against profit altogether. I think the market serves a very important purpose, but it's got to serve very important people at the same time. And when you see the model that works so well in cooperative housing, I can't think about the analogies that we can use to embrace community land trusts. When you actually have communities who know their needs, who know their opportunities, and can be empowered to be put in charge of the decisions that are going to be taken that impact their own well-being, their neighbors' well-being, their family's well-being, you're going to have better decisions. It's very easy for governments who are tasked with allocating other people's money to make mistakes. But when you're talking about your home and your community, you tend to get people who care about the decisions that sit around the decision-making table. Now, I try to think about these conversations, what I can take from them. I think first, I think about how I can become better informed. I see such incredible participation with Nova Scotians here with the network. And it makes me really, really proud of the place that I call home. But it also creates in me a sense that we have greater capacity than perhaps I realized, even before I walked into the room this evening. I also seek to think how we can find partners who are going to deliver on the projects. We can come up with funds, we can come up with ideas, but we don't deliver programs from behind closed doors in Parliament Hill. Our partners deliver them in communities. Identifying land trusts who can actually become our partner organizations to deliver housing developments in complete communities is an enormous source of potential I'm going to take from tonight. But it's also important we take inspiration from one another. When I see these stories of hope, when I think Aston Martin creating employment opportunities, when I see people who come together in an artist collective to allow residents to maintain the ability to live in the building that they call home, take ownership over it and make decisions about it in perpetuity going forward, I see huge opportunities for us to mirror those successful examples in Canadian policy frameworks. But I also see massive opportunities for us to incorporate some of the values in what's coming next on the housing plan for Canada. I think in particular about a problem we're trying to figure out right now. We are the biggest landowner in the country as the federal government. We want to use that land to actually make sure we can provide homes for people who don't have them at prices they can actually afford. The land trust model lends itself perfectly to federal lands where there may not be anything here today that we can embrace as either run both by the government and by communities to actually embrace the concept that people who are going to live in a community can be empowered to make decisions over it. This has been an extraordinary privilege to join you here tonight, but let this be the start of an important conversation, not a one and done. I want to say thank you so much to the folks who organized. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here tonight. It's been an immense privilege, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you.